The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that could cause a headache, while three teenagers near the soda aisle whispered and aimed their phones like loaded weapons. Sarah tightened her grip on the shopping cart, unaware she was the target of a joke she hadn't yet heard, focused only on the crushing weight of the counted coins in her pocket. But near the dairy section, a man rocking back and forth seemed to feel a vibration of cruelty no one else could hear, his fingers trembling in a way that promised this wouldn't end the way the boys expected. Sarah moved through the aisles with the practiced efficiency of someone who knows exactly how far a dollar can stretch before it completely breaks. Her mental calculator ran an invisible marathon, subtracting the price of milk and adding the cheapest brand of cereal, hoping the total wouldn't trigger a declined beep at the checkout. She kept her two children close, her hand constantly brushing their shoulders, a silent radar ensuring they didn't knock over anything she couldn't afford to replace. The air inside the supermarket felt thick, heavy with the humid breath of hundreds of people rushing to finish chores they hated on an ordinary afternoon. Carts collided like bumper cars, metal screeching against metal, creating a symphony of impatience that seemed much louder than usual for a Tuesday. No one made eye contact. Gazes were glued to screens or shopping lists, creating a strange isolation in the middle of the crowd, the perfect camouflage for something malicious to grow unnoticed. A few feet away, Elias stood staring at the geometric patterns of the floor tiles, finding temporary comfort in the predictable repetition of the lines. For him, the store wasn't just a place to buy food. It was a sensory battlefield, where the beeping of scanners sounded like starter pistols. He wore headphones that weren't connected to anything, a fragile shield against the world's roar. But today the noise felt different, carrying a vibration of intent that made his skin crawl. Sarah paused by the bread, her hand hovering over a package that cost 50 cents less, but which she knew tasted like day-old cardboard. She felt eyes on the back of her neck, that primal instinct that warns prey when a predator is near, but when she turned, she saw only empty, distracted smiles. The group of teenagers had moved closer, their phones held at waist height, the red recording lights blinking like small, accusing eyes in the shadows, but she attributed the feeling to her own paranoia and exhaustion. Elias saw the teenagers too, but he didn't just see phones. He saw shifts in their body language that signaled danger, like a sudden drop in barometric pressure before a storm. He hummed a lone note to himself, a grounding sound to keep his anxiety from spilling over into a scream in the middle of the aisle. He noticed the way they looked at the woman with the cart, their smiles sharp and predatory, and his stomach tightened with a familiar knot, for he knew exactly what it was like when people decided someone didn't belong. The plan was simple and cruel, designed for maximum humiliation and the highest possible number of views on a platform hungry for the misery of others. One of the boys nudged the other, a silent signal to start the performance they had rehearsed in whispers outside the automatic entrance. They weren't looking for a fair fight. They were looking for an uncontrolled reaction, something they could edit into 60 seconds of scorn, and Sarah was just an object in their script, a convenient target because she looked too exhausted to fight back. Sarah checked her wallet again, counting the crumpled bills for the third time, praying they hadn't magically decreased in value since she left home. Her daughter pulled on her sleeve, asking for a chocolate bar, and the no that followed tasted like ash in Sarah's mouth, heavy with maternal guilt. Denying small joys was a daily ritual, but doing it while feeling watched made the shame burn hotter under her skin, and she just wanted to get to the checkout, pay, and disappear into the safety of her old car. The distance between Sarah's cart and Elias's spot on the floor was shrinking as the store traffic pushed them into the same bottleneck in the central aisle. Two worlds were about to collide. The exhausted mother trying to remain invisible, and the man who, by his nature, couldn't help but stand out. The teenagers positioned themselves perfectly to capture the intersection, anticipating a social accident that would make their day, while the store's music shifted to an upbeat pop song, a dissonant soundtrack to the tension surrounding them. A glass jar shattered in the next aisle, the sound exploding through the store and freezing everyone in place for a brief moment of collective shock. For Elias, it wasn't just a noise. It was a physical pain, a spike driving into his ears that made him immediately clap his hands over his head in defense. Sarah jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs, her protective instinct firing as she pulled her children against her legs, but the laughter that followed the crash didn't sound like an accident. It sounded like a starting signal. It began with a subtle block. A cart accidentally pushed into Sarah's path, forcing her to stop abruptly and apologize for something she didn't do. The boy didn't move, just stared at her with a blank expression that was more unnerving than an aggressive scowl, testing the limits of her patience. It was a dominance test, a way to see if she would shrink or react, and Sarah, conditioned by years of keeping her head down to survive, chose silence and maneuvered around him, her face flushing without realizing this was just the opening act. Elias stopped rocking as the pattern on the floor no longer held his attention, for the pattern of human behavior unfolding before him was broken and wrong. He saw the boy block the woman. He saw the other one filming. He felt the injustice like a rock in his shoe, impossible to ignore. Most people filtered out these small aggressions, pretending not to see to avoid conflict, but Elias's brain couldn't filter out the error. It just sat there, pulsing, demanding to be fixed with an intensity that scared him. The air around them seemed to drop a few degrees, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with the frozen food section and everything to do with human malice. Other shoppers glanced over, saw a woman struggling to pass and a strange man staring, and chose the path of least resistance. They looked away. Indifference is often more painful than cruelty, because it validates the attacker, and in that moment, the silence of the crowd was deafening, making Sarah feel a tear sting her eye, which she blinked away furiously to hide. She reached for the last item on her list, a carton of eggs, her hand trembling slightly as she felt the boys close in behind her again. It's terrifying how quickly a public space can turn into a cage when you realize no one will come to help if something happens. Before we see what happens when the first harsh word is finally spoken, tell me something honest. Have you ever seen something wrong happening in public and frozen because you were afraid to intervene? Put it in the comments below if you've ever felt that fear or if you acted. The boy opened his mouth to speak, but Elias took a step forward, breaking his own rule of invisibility. Here is the rewrite of the entire text in English, maintaining the emotional depth and dark psychology tone of the previous segment. Elias did not plan the step. His body moved before his thoughts had time to argue with it, one foot sliding forward until he stood almost level with Sarah's cart. The movement, too small to be called a confrontation, was enough to turn heads all around, as if someone had lowered the store's volume for an invisible second. Glances that previously passed right through Sarah now stopped, evaluating not just the tired mother, but also the man who looked out of place beside her, like two errors in the same frame. Sarah felt the weight of those eyes landing on her skin like fine dust that stuck deep inside, difficult to scrub away even after everything was over. They weren't just people looking. They were people comparing, measuring, mentally classifying the kind of mother she must be, the kind of life she must lead. She already knew that silent judgment from other places, from welfare lines, from courthouse hallways, from whispered conversations with her eldest son's father. And she knew that to strangers, her entire story was reduced to a label stuck to her forehead. The whispers began slowly. First, as an indistinct hiss she tried to ignore, assuming they were just comments about sales or complaints about long lines. But as the sound took shape, loose words began to stand out, like shards of glass amidst sand. Alone? Look at that. Can't even control her kids. Her daughter instinctively moved closer to the cart, as if she too felt something was wrong, even though she didn't yet have the vocabulary to name the discomfort. The boy with the phone raised the device slightly, just enough so the lens was aligned with Sarah's face, but low enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy. She noticed a strange glint in the corner of her eye, and for a second wondered if she was being filmed, a thought too fleeting to be clear enough to reject. No one would care to record a moment of embarrassment from a random woman, she thought, and that same phrase came accompanied by another. Or perhaps that is exactly why. Elias felt the gazes changing direction, some shifting away from Sarah and landing on him, as if an invisible camera had made a slight framing adjustment. He knew what that kind of attention meant because he had seen the same set of expressions when he spoke too loudly without realizing it, or when he rocked his body in the middle of a silent cue. To many there, he wasn't a man trying to take care of himself in a noisy place. He was just that weird guy, and any step he took toward a conflict would be automatically read as a threat. The impromptu line in the aisle began to grow. Carts stopped behind the silent blockade created by the teenagers and Sarah's hesitation. An older woman huffed loudly, making sure her impatience was heard, even though she didn't say a direct word to anyone. The message was clear. You are in the way, sort yourselves out, or move. It was in this type of indirect messaging that Sarah grew up, learning from an early age that even when nothing was said, a great deal was still communicated. "Mom, are we in trouble?" her oldest son asked, his voice low enough to try and escape the ears of others, but too loud to escape her heart. Sarah forced a smile that hurt her cheeks, trying to look calm while swallowing the feeling that, somehow, yes, they were always in some kind of trouble. "We are fine, sweetie, just stay close," she replied, knowing that phrase was more wish than truth, more armor than information. A store employee passed by pushing a restocking cart, glanced at the scene, and kept walking, his eyes sliding over the three of them as if they were mere aisle obstacles. Further back, someone with a manager's badge stopped for an instant, evaluating with the clinical gaze of someone measuring risks and potential complaints. Sarah felt, even before any approach, that if things escalated, she would be seen as the problem, not the boys with the phone, not the silent crowd. For Elias, the whispers transformed into an electric hum, an extra layer over the background pain of the supermarket sounds. He picked up fragments of sentences like someone trying to tune an old radio. "Look at him. Doesn't even look normal. Film it. Film it." He didn't know if they were talking about him, her, or both, but the uncertainty only made everything worse, because any interpretation pointed to the same uncomfortable place. Here, they weren't people. They were a spectacle. Sarah noticed twisted mouths, raised eyebrows, looks that swept over her simple clothes and her children's worn sneakers, as if analyzing evidence of an undeclared crime. She felt the almost physical impulse to shrink, to fit into less space, to occupy less air, as if that could reduce the intensity of the judgments. In a matter of seconds, she went from customer to defendant in a court with no visible judge, where the sentence was delivered only by the way people looked away too late. Elias tried to speak, but the words hit an invisible wall inside his throat, as if every syllable had become too large to pass. He mentally rehearsed complete, polite sentences, the kind therapists always told him to practice. "Please, give her space. This is not funny. She is just shopping." However, each of these phrases seemed too long, too complex for the moment, and the fear of freezing in the middle of them nearly paralyzed him completely. When he finally managed it, what came out was simple, almost small but clean, like a fresh cut. "She just wants to buy food." The phrase wasn't spoken loudly, but it wasn't whispered either. It existed at a volume that forced the nearest people to hear it, even if they would have preferred not to. For a second, the environment seemed to hold its breath, as if the air itself was surprised that someone had broken the unwritten rule of not getting involved. The boy with the phone smiled to the side, a smile that held nothing of amusement but everything of satisfaction, as if that reaction was exactly within what he hoped to capture. "This is even better," he murmured to his friend, not caring if anyone understood or not, his eyes shining with the anticipation of a video that now had more than one target. Suddenly, it wasn't just the out-of-control mom they could expect. It was also the weirdo interfering where he isn't wanted, two perfect characters for a script that no one there, besides them, knew existed. Sarah didn't hear exactly what the boy said, but she felt the shift in energy, as if the scene had moved from casual embarrassment to something more organized, more directed. It no longer seemed like just a bunch of loose glances. It felt like a group of people waiting for a specific moment, as if following invisible instructions. And for the first time, an uncomfortable question began to form in her mind, crawling slowly between fear and shame. What if those looks weren't just judgment, but part of something someone here wanted to see through to the end? The boy with the phone didn't even try to hide the lens anymore. He held it steady, like a director framing the perfect shot. A second boy leaned in, dropping a comment just loud enough for Sarah to hear, a sharp jab about her cheap sneakers that felt less like an observation and more like a cue. Sarah froze, her hands gripping the cart so tight her knuckles turned white, realizing this wasn't random rudeness, it was choreography. The store, once just loud and chaotic, suddenly felt like a stage where everyone knew their lines except her. Elias saw the pattern shift again, the chaos organizing itself into something malicious and deliberate. He noticed a third person further back, holding another phone at a different angle, capturing the scene from a wider perspective, creating a multi-camera setup for whatever cruel show this was. His brain, usually overwhelmed by too much information, now locked onto these details with frightening clarity, connecting the dots that most people were too polite or too busy to see. It wasn't just bullying, it was production. Sarah tried to move past them, muttering a polite, "Excuse me," that sounded weak even to her own ears. But the boys didn't budge. They shifted just enough to keep her blocked while making it look accidental to anyone watching from a distance. One of them laughed, a short, sharp sound that felt like a slap, and Sarah felt a wave of heat rise up her neck, the realization dawning that they weren't going to let her leave until they got what they came for. The shoppers nearby started to slow down, their curiosity piqued by the subtle conflict, drawn in like moths to a flame. No one intervened, of course. They just watched, their eyes darting between the woman, the strange man, and the teenagers, trying to figure out who the villain was. This passive audience was exactly what the boys needed. A silent chorus that amplified the tension without lifting a finger, turning the aisle into a pressure cooker waiting to explode. Elias felt the vibration of the confrontation in his chest, a physical thrumming that made his breath come in short, shallow gasps. He wanted to cover his ears, to squeeze his eyes shut and rock until the world went away. But he couldn't look away from Sarah's face. He saw the panic rising in her eyes, the same panic he felt when the world became too much, and a strange, fierce protectiveness surged through him, overriding his own fear. Suddenly, one of the boys knocked a box of cereal from Sarah's cart, the cardboard hitting the floor with a soft thud that sounded impossibly loud in the tense silence. "Oops," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, his eyes never leaving the camera lens of his friend's phone. It was a small act, petty and childish, but it was the first physical breach, the crossing of a line that signaled things were about to escalate from awkward to ugly. Sarah stared at the box on the floor, her mind racing with a dozen different reactions, none of them safe. Picking it up felt like submission. Leaving it felt like defeat. Shouting felt like giving them exactly the show they wanted. She was trapped in a lose-lose scenario, paralyzed by the fear that any move she made would be the wrong one, twisted and edited later to make her look crazy or incompetent to thousands of strangers online. Elias stepped closer, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, but his intent clear as day. He didn't look at the boys. He looked at the box on the floor, his brain fixated on the object that was out of place, the disruption in the order of things. To him, the fallen box was a wrong note in a song, a glitch in the code, and his entire being screamed to correct it, regardless of the social cost. The air in the aisle grew heavy, charged with the static of anticipated violence or public meltdown. People held their breath, waiting for the snap, the scream, the moment that would make the video go viral. It was a cruel kind of entertainment, this waiting for someone to break, and the boys knew it, feeding off the energy, pushing just a little harder to see how far they could bend reality before it snapped back. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, hot and humiliating, blurring her vision as she looked around for help that wasn't coming. She saw judgment in the eyes of a woman clutching a purse, She saw amusement on the face of a man in a suit. It felt like the whole world was in on the joke, a conspiracy of cruelty designed to make her feel small, and for a terrifying moment, she wondered if maybe she deserved it. Then, the boy with the camera spoke, his voice clear and mocking, designed to be picked up by the microphone. "Can't you even handle a grocery trip?" he asked, framing the question like a concern but delivering it like an insult. It was a line scripted to provoke, to elicit anger or tears, to create the perfect soundbite for a thumbnail, and it hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Elias flinched at the tone, the frequency of the voice grating against his nerves like sandpaper on glass. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and saw not just a stranger, but a reflection of his own daily struggle to fit into a world that didn't want him. And in that moment of shared vulnerability, something shifted in the dynamic of the aisle, a silent acknowledgement that the game was rigged. The audience sensed it too, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that suggested this wasn't just a prank anymore. The laughter from the onlookers died down, replaced by an uneasy silence as they waited to see who would make the next move. Who would have the courage to turn humiliation into entertainment, and who would just stand there and watch it happen? The boy's voice cut through the silence again, louder this time, aiming for the back rows of the store. "Hey, lady, maybe you shouldn't be shopping if you can't afford to pay attention," he jeered, pointing at her worn-out purse. It wasn't just a comment anymore. It was an accusation thrown into the public square, designed to strip away whatever dignity she had left. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, the shame so acute it felt like a physical blow to the stomach. Her children huddled closer, sensing the danger in the tone, their small hands gripping her jeans like lifelines in a storm. Sarah wanted to scream, to defend herself, to explain she worked 2 jobs and was doing her best, but her throat closed up tight. The words died before they could reach her lips, suffocated by the fear that anything she said would just be fuel for their fire. The crowd around them seemed to lean in, a collective intake of breath as the spectacle reached a new peak of cruelty. Phones were raised higher, screens glowing with the promise of capturing a breakdown in high definition, ready to share the moment with the world. No one stepped forward to help. The bystander effect was in full swing, turning decent people into paralyzed voyeurs of someone else's pain. Elias rocked on his heels, the rhythm faster now, his hands fluttering at his sides like trapped birds trying to escape a cage. The noise of the confrontation was a chaotic static in his head, overwhelming his senses, making it hard to think or breathe. But through the noise, he heard the sadness in Sarah's silence, a frequency of despair that resonated deep within his own lonely experiences. "She's probably stealing," the second boy added, throwing the lie out casually, knowing exactly how damaging it would be. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous, changing the narrative instantly from bullying to justice in the eyes of the uninformed. Heads turned sharper now, eyes narrowing with suspicion, the sympathy evaporating as the label of thief was stamped onto her forehead. Sarah gasped, the injustice of it stinging more than the insults about her poverty, a direct attack on her integrity. She looked around wildly, hoping someone would see the truth, but saw only doubt reflected in the faces of the strangers surrounding her. It is terrifying how quickly a lie can become the truth when spoken with confidence in a crowded room. The manager, who had been watching from a distance, finally started walking over, his face set in a grim line of professional annoyance. Sarah's heart sank. She knew how this looked, a poor woman causing a scene, accused of theft by confident, well-dressed kids. The system wasn't built to protect people like her in moments like this. It was built to remove the disturbance. Elias saw the manager approaching, saw the badge and the authority, and felt a surge of panic that usually made him run away. But today his feet felt rooted to the spot, anchored by the invisible thread connecting him to the woman who was being crushed. He muttered to himself, repeating a mantra of calm that wasn't working, trying to organize the chaotic data of the situation into something he could solve. "Check her bag," someone from the back shouted, emboldened by the boy's accusations, joining the mob mentality with eager cruelty. The suggestion rippled through the onlookers, a wave of agreement that demanded a public search, a violation of privacy for their entertainment. Sarah clutched her purse to her chest, not because she had anything to hide, but because it was the last piece of herself she controlled. The isolation was complete now. Sarah stood alone in a circle of judgment, her children crying softly against her legs. The fluorescent lights seemed to brighten, putting her under a harsh spotlight where every flaw and fear was exposed for consumption. She felt small, smaller than she had ever felt, shrinking under the weight of 100 eyes that saw her as a problem, not a person. "I didn't take anything," she whispered, her voice trembling and weak, barely audible over the hum of the refrigeration units. It sounded like a plea, not a defense, and the boys smirked, knowing they had won the psychological war without throwing a single punch. They had broken her spirit in public, and the camera was rolling to catch every second of her defeat. Elias stopped rocking abruptly, his eyes locking onto the boy who had shouted the accusation about stealing. His brain processed the lie as a factual error, a distinct incorrectness in the equation of the moment that needed to be balanced. He didn't understand social nuances, but he understood truth and falsehood, and this was a falsehood that was hurting someone physically. The manager arrived, asking, "What is going on here?" in a tone that suggested he had already decided who was at fault. He didn't look at the boys. He looked straight at Sarah, his posture demanding submission and an explanation she was too shaken to give. The silence that followed was thick with tension, a pause before the final verdict was delivered by the court of public opinion. And in that silence, a terrifying thought bloomed in the minds of everyone watching, a question that hung unanswered. What if no one steps in? What if this woman is destroyed right here in front of everyone, and we all just watch it happen like it's a TV show? The possibility of total moral failure hovered over the aisle, waiting to see if anyone would dare to be the exception. The sensory overload hit Elias like a tidal wave, crashing over his defenses and drowning out his ability to filter the world. The chatter of the crowd, the beep of registers, the humming lights, and the boys' mocking laughter merged into a single deafening roar. He covered his ears with his hands, squeezing tight, his eyes darting frantically around the aisle, searching for an escape route. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths, the air feeling too thin to fill his lungs, panic rising like bile in his throat. To the onlookers, his behavior looked like aggression, a sudden, inexplicable shift from quiet observer to potential threat. A woman pulled her child back, whispering something about drug addicts, her ignorance painting a dangerous label on his distress. Elias felt the shift in their energy, a jagged spike of fear directed at him, and it only amplified his own terror. He was trapped in a feedback loop of anxiety, his body reacting to the hostility by becoming more erratic, which in turn created more hostility. Sarah saw him out of the corner of her eye, recognizing the look of someone whose world was spinning too fast to hold on to. For a split second, her own humiliation took a backseat to a flicker of empathy for the man unraveling beside her. She knew what it felt like to be overwhelmed, to feel the walls closing in, even if her triggers were different from his. It was a shared language of vulnerability that connected them in the chaos, unseen by the predators circling them. The boys, sensing a new opportunity for drama, turned their phones towards Elias, zooming in on his rocking and his covered ears. "Look at this guy, he's tweaking out," one of them laughed, narrating the scene for his future audience. They didn't see a human being in pain, they saw content, a bizarre twist to add to their video that would guarantee comments and shares. Their cruelty was casual, efficient, and utterly devoid of understanding, treating his suffering as a prop for their amusement. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, trying to visualize his safe place, a quiet room with white walls and soft textures, but the image kept shattering. The boy's voice was a drill in his skull, tweaking out, repeating in an echo chamber of mockery that distorted reality. He started to hum louder, a discordant melody meant to block out the external noise, but it only drew more stares. He was fighting a war inside his own head, while fighting a separate war against the judgment of the store. The manager stepped back, clearly unsure how to handle a woman accused of theft and a man apparently losing his mind. He reached for his radio, likely calling for security, escalating a situation that needed compassion into a security threat. The sterile, corporate response to human distress was almost as cruel as the boy's taunts, a rejection of empathy in favor of protocol. Sarah felt a new wave of hopelessness. Now they would both be thrown out, or worse, arrested. "He's probably with her, part of the distraction," the second boy yelled, weaving a narrative that tied Elias's meltdown to the imaginary theft. It was a brilliant, evil improvisation, linking the two outcasts together in a conspiracy that justified everyone's suspicion. The crowd nodded, the logic appealing to their desire for a simple explanation. The weird guy and the poor woman were partners in crime. It was easier to believe they were bad than to admit the crowd was wrong. Elias felt the accusation hit him, not as words, but as a wave of negative intent that made his skin burn. He stopped humming and opened his eyes, which were wide and filled with a confusing mix of terror and clarity. He looked at the boy, then at Sarah, his brain struggling to process the complex lie that had just been constructed. He wanted to shout, "False!" but his vocal cords were frozen, locked down by the sheer weight of the stress. Sarah stepped instinctively between Elias and the manager, a protective gesture she didn't even think about before doing. "Leave him alone! He's not doing anything!" she cried out, her voice cracking but fierce. It was a moment of startling bravery, defending a stranger while she was under attack herself, a spark of humanity in the darkness. The boys laughed harder, mocking her defense as proof of their guilt, twisting her kindness into evidence. The security guard arrived, a large man with a bored expression who clearly just wanted to get through his shift without paperwork. He looked at Elias, then at Sarah, his hand resting on his belt near his radio and handcuffs. The physical threat of force was now present, hanging over the aisle like a storm cloud, ready to break. Elias flinched at the sight of the uniform, a symbol of authority that had rarely been on his side in the past. "Everyone calm down or everyone leaves," the guard boomed, his voice authoritative but lacking any attempt at de-escalation. He wasn't trying to solve the problem. He was trying to silence it, to sweep the mess out of the store and onto the street. The boys lowered their phones slightly but didn't stop recording, knowing the real action might be just starting. They were waiting for the snap, for the arrest, for the climax of their cruel little movie. Elias's hands shook violently, his fingers tapping against his temples in a frantic rhythm that matched his racing heart. He felt the precipice approaching, that edge where control is lost and the meltdown takes over completely. It is a terrifying place to be, losing the pilot's seat of your own body while an audience watches and judges. He knew if he crossed that line, there would be no coming back to dignity in this place. The crowd watched with bated breath. The tension stretched so thin it felt like a wire about to snap and whip them all. Some looked eager for the takedown. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps realizing things had gone too far but too cowardly to speak. It was the moment where tragedy feels inevitable, where the script seems written in stone and the ending is always bad. But in the chaos, Elias's tapping fingers found a rhythm, a pattern that wasn't random. And in that rhythm, he found a tiny anchor, a small point of focus that kept him from falling into the abyss. He looked at the cereal box still on the floor, the catalyst for it all, lying there like an uncorrected error. His brain latched onto it, obsessing over the injustice of its placement, the wrongness of the cause. Would he snap and lash out, or would the pressure cook him into something else entirely? The boy with the camera took a step closer to Sarah, invading her personal space with a smirk that was all teeth and no warmth. "Gonna cry?" he taunted softly. The words meant only for her in the microphone, a final push to break her composure. It was a precision strike, aimed at her dignity, designed to reduce a grown woman to a sobbing mess for internet clout. Sarah bit her lip so hard she tasted copper, holding back tears with every ounce of strength she had left. Elias saw the proximity, the intrusion into the bubble of personal space that he held so sacred and essential for survival. To him, the boy wasn't just being rude. He was violating a fundamental law of physics and respect, crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. The vibration of the boy's malice felt like heat radiating off pavement, oppressive and suffocating, choking the air in the aisle. Elias stopped rocking, his body going rigid, coiled tight like a spring pressed down to its absolute limit. "Maybe if you had a job, you wouldn't need to steal," the boy continued, escalating the narrative for his viewers, painting her as a villain to justify his cruelty. The crowd murmured, the lie taking root deeper with every repetition, creating a false reality that was becoming harder to fight. Sarah looked at the faces around her, searching for one ally, one person who saw through the performance, but found only blank stares. She felt the ground beneath her crumbling, the isolation absolute and terrifying. The manager crossed his arms, tapping his foot, his patience clearly exhausted by the drama disrupting his store's flow. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see inside your bag now," he said, his voice dropping the pretense of a request. It was an order, a public strip search of her privacy, sanctioned by the authority of the store and the silence of the mob. Sarah clutched the bag tighter, her knuckles white, knowing that opening it was an admission of guilt she hadn't earned. "Do it! Do it!" the boys chanted, turning the demand into a playground jeer, egging on the authority figure to do their dirty work. Their laughter was sharp, jagged, cutting through the tense atmosphere like broken glass, reveling in the power they held over adults. They were the puppeteers of this misery, pulling strings they didn't understand, careless of the damage they were causing to real human lives. Elias's eyes darted from the manager to the boy, his brain processing the variables, the proximity, the volume, the injustice, the fear radiating from Sarah. The chaotic data began to align into a single unbearable point of pressure, a singularity of wrongness that demanded correction. He couldn't process the social hierarchy, but he could process the imbalance of power, and it was screaming at him. The security guard took a step forward, his hand moving towards Sarah's arm, ready to physically enforce the manager's demand. It was the moment where words fail and force takes over, the threshold where civilization breaks down into bullying with a badge. Sarah flinched, pulling her children behind her, a primal defense against a threat that was closing in from all sides. The children buried their faces in her coat, too scared to watch, their small bodies trembling in sync with hers. "Don't touch her," a voice said, but it wasn't Elias. It was a whisper in the back of the crowd that no one acknowledged. The silence of the majority was a heavy blanket, smothering the tiny spark of conscience that might have existed in the room. This is how tragedy happens, not with a bang, but with the quiet permission of good people who do nothing. The boy laughed again. "She's guilty as hell, look at her," pointing a finger right in Sarah's face, mere inches from her nose. It was the final straw, the physical gesture that broke the barrier of verbal abuse and entered the realm of physical threat. Sarah closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable, waiting for the hand on her shoulder or the grab for her bag. But the grab never came because something else happened first, something that wasn't in the boy's script or the manager's protocol. Elias moved. It wasn't a violent lunge or a frantic flailing. It was a step of absolute, terrifying purpose. He placed himself directly between the boy and Sarah, a human shield made of trembling nerves and unwavering resolve. He didn't look at the boy's face. He looked at the hand pointing the finger, his gaze intense and focused on the offending limb. "Too close," Elias stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, stating a fact rather than making a threat. It was a simple observation of a boundary violation, but spoken with such strange conviction that it halted the boy mid-laugh. The boy blinked, confused by the interruption, his rhythm thrown off by the unexpected obstacle in his path. "Get out of the way, freak," he sneered, trying to regain control, but his voice wavered slightly. He wasn't used to resistance. He was used to victims who shrank away, not obstacles that stood firm and stared at his hands. Elias didn't move an inch. He didn't blink. He simply occupied the space that the boy wanted to use for his aggression. He was a statue of resistance, vibrating with anxiety, but rooted in place by a moral imperative he couldn't articulate, but felt deeply. The air crackled with the potential for violence, the tension pulled so tight it hummed. And then, the boy made a mistake. He reached out to shove Elias, to physically move the obstruction aside. It was the moment that would define everything, the crossing of the physical line that separates bullying from assault. The crowd gasped, the phone steadied, and time seemed to slow down as the hand moved towards Elias's chest. What happens when an unstoppable force of cruelty meets an immovable object of pure, unfiltered honesty? The boy's hand connected with Elias's chest, a shove meant to assert dominance, but it felt like pushing against a brick wall. Elias didn't stumble back. Instead, he absorbed the impact with a startling rigidity, his body locking into place as if rooted to the store's linoleum. He didn't strike back or shout. He simply looked down at the hand touching him, his expression one of profound confusion and intense focus. Then, slowly, deliberately, Elias reached into his own pocket, a movement that made the security guard tense and reach for his belt. The crowd flinched, expecting a weapon, a knife, something violent to match the escalating tension of the scene. Even the boys took a step back, the camera shaking slightly as their bravado cracked under the unpredictable nature of the quiet guy. But Elias didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a small, crumpled receipt from a previous purchase, smoothing it out with trembling fingers. He held it up, not to the boys, but to the space between them, as if it were a shield or a holy talisman. "Calculated," Elias said, his voice cutting through the noise with a strange, robotic clarity. He turned to Sarah's cart, his eyes scanning the contents with the speed of a barcode reader, muttering numbers under his breath. Milk, $3.50. Cereal, $2.90. Bread, $1.50. Total, $7.90. He recited the prices from memory, his mind finding refuge in the absolute certainty of mathematics, amidst the chaos of human cruelty. The boy laughed nervously. "What is he doing? Rain Man?" Trying to recover the comedic angle, but the laughter fell flat. The crowd was no longer looking at a potential fight. They were watching something they didn't understand, a performance of intellect that defied the situation. Elias ignored the taunt, his focus narrowing down to the only thing that mattered, the truth of the numbers versus the lie of the theft. Bag empty of theft. "Bag full of budget," Elias stated, pointing a shaking finger at Sarah's purse, then back to the items in her cart. He looked at the manager, his eyes wide and pleading, not for mercy, but for accuracy. She counted. I watched. She counted 3 times. Math is correct. Accusation is error. It was a defense attorney's closing argument delivered in the fragmented syntax of a mind that saw the world differently. Sarah stared at him, tears finally spilling over, not from fear this time, but from the shock of being truly seen. He hadn't just been standing there. He had been witnessing her struggle, validating her invisible labor of budgeting down to the last cent. In a world that ignored her, this stranger had paid attention to the most mundane and painful detail of her life, her poverty. The manager paused, his hand falling away from his radio, the certainty of his bias shaken by the sheer specificity of Elias's defense. A thief doesn't count pennies. A thief doesn't agonize over the price of bread. The logic pierced through the prejudice, forcing him to look at Sarah not as a suspect but as a customer trying to survive. "He's right," a quiet voice spoke up from the crowd, the woman who had earlier pulled her child away. "I saw her counting too." She put the chocolate back. The domino effect began. One voice of truth emboldened another, breaking the spell of the bystander effect. Suddenly, the narrative the boys had built was crumbling under the weight of corroborated reality. The boys sensed the tide turning, the audience they thought they controlled now looking at them with dawning suspicion. "Whatever. They're both freaks," the leader scoffed, trying to dismiss the scene and retreat with his ego intact. He lowered his phone, signaling the end of the show. But Elias wasn't done. Elias stepped towards the boy, holding out the crumpled receipt as if offering a peace treaty that was actually an indictment. "Cruelty is inefficient," he said, looking directly into the camera lens that was now pointed at the floor. "Why create pain? Pain is heavy. Kindness is light." It was a philosophical mic drop, delivered with the innocence of a child and the wisdom of a sage. The aisle fell completely silent, the kind of silence that happens in church or after a sudden tragedy. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating, stripping away the boy's cool facade to reveal the ugliness underneath. For a moment, even the fluorescent lights seemed less harsh, softened by the sudden influx of humanity. Sarah reached out and gently touched Elias's arm, a gesture of gratitude that bridged the gap between their two isolated worlds. He flinched slightly but didn't pull away, accepting the contact as a valid data point in this new equation. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words carried the weight of a life saved from drowning. The manager cleared his throat, his face flushing with a different kind of shame, the shame of having been wrong. I apologize, ma'am," he muttered, unable to meet her eyes, gesturing for the security guard to stand down. The authority had been reset, not by force, but by the undeniable truth of a man who couldn't tell a lie. The boys turned to leave, their laughter gone, their video ruined by a moral victory they couldn't edit out. But as they walked away, the crowd didn't part for them. People stood their ground, forcing the boys to weave through a gauntlet of disappointed stares. It wasn't a punishment, but a mirror, reflecting their ugliness back at them. And in the center of it all stood Elias, still holding his receipt, his breathing slowing down as the world returned to a manageable volume. He didn't know he was a hero, he just knew the equation was balanced again. But why did the silence linger so long after the boys were gone? The silence in the aisle wasn't empty. It was heavy with the collective realization of what had almost happened. People shifted on their feet, looking at their own shoes or at the shelves, anywhere but at Sarah and Elias. The shame had transferred from the victims to the witnesses, a silent contagion that made everyone suddenly aware of their own inaction. It was a rare moment where a group of strangers shared a single, uncomfortable thought. I was wrong. Elias, oblivious to the complex social guilt swirling around him, simply returned to his rocking, though the tempo was slower now. The crisis had passed, the error corrected, and his system was attempting to reboot to its default state. He didn't seek applause or acknowledgement. His intervention had been a necessity of his nature, not a bid for glory. To him, the aisle was just an aisle again, albeit one with a lingering static of emotional residue. Sarah wiped her face with the back of her hand, the adrenaline fading to leave behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She looked at her children, checking them for invisible wounds, smoothing their hair with trembling fingers. They looked back at her with wide eyes, having learned a lesson about the world today that no school could teach. "It's okay now," she murmured, a promise she hoped she could keep. A woman in a business suit, who had watched the entire scene with her arms crossed, slowly uncrossed them. She reached into her purse, not for a phone, but for a tissue, which she extended towards Sarah with a hesitant hand. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, but it broke the dam of paralysis that held the crowd. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I should have said something sooner." That single apology acted like a key unlocking a door. Suddenly, the energy in the aisle shifted from judgment to awkward benevolence. Another shopper picked up the cereal box Elias had stared at and placed it gently back in Sarah's cart. Someone else moved their cart to clear the path completely, an offering of space that had been denied earlier. The mob, which had been a weapon moments ago, was trying clumsily to become a community. The manager, still red-faced, muttered something about a discount at the register and scurried away, eager to escape the scene of his failure. His retreat signaled the official end of the confrontation, but no one moved to leave just yet. They were held there by the gravity of Elias's presence, the man who had been the freak and was now the only one with clean hands. Elias noticed the change in the atmosphere, the reduction of spiky energy, as he classified it in his mind. The air felt softer, less abrasive against his skin, and the colors of the cereal boxes seemed to return to their normal saturation. He looked at the tissue in Sarah's hand, then at the woman who gave it, processing this new data. Kindness could follow cruelty. Calculated, Elias whispered again, but this time the word felt different, less like a defense and more like an observation of the changing tides. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time, he offered a tentative, fleeting smile, a glitch in his usual stoicism. It was his way of saying equation balanced, a silent nod to their shared survival in a hostile ecosystem. Sarah returned the smile, weak but genuine, a connection forged in the fire of public humiliation. She realized that while the crowd was apologizing now, it was this man, this stranger with the rocking body and the receipt, who had saved her. He hadn't needed social cues or courage. He had just needed the truth, and that was a powerful thing. A teenage girl, perhaps the same age as the boys who had left, stepped forward and looked at Elias with genuine curiosity. "You're really good at math," she said, a simple compliment that bridged the gap between his world and hers. Elias blinked, surprised by the direct input that wasn't an attack. "Numbers don't lie," he replied simply. "People do." The simple truth of his statement hung in the air, a final verdict on the event that no one could argue with. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting the messy, dishonest reality of human interaction against the clean purity of logic. The girl nodded, looking thoughtful, perhaps reconsidering the definitions of smart and weird she had been taught. Sarah finally started to push her cart forward, the wheels squeaking a familiar rhythm that now sounded like victory. The path cleared instantly, people stepping aside with deference, almost like a guard of honor for a queen and her knight. She wasn't just a poor mother anymore, she was a survivor, and Elias was her unexpected champion. As she passed Elias, she stopped for one brief second, leaning in close so only he could hear. "You are not invisible," she whispered, giving him the gift of being seen, just as he had done for her. Elias stopped rocking completely for a heartbeat, the words planting a seed in his mind that might grow later. He watched her walk away towards the checkout, his receipt still clutched in his hand like a trophy. The store noise returned. The PA system announced a cleanup in aisle 4, and life resumed its chaotic march. But the air in that specific aisle felt different, charged with a lingering sense of redemption. And as the shoppers dispersed, carrying the memory of the crazy guy who spoke the sanest words of the day, a question remained. Who was actually tested in that store? The single mom, the autistic man, or the silent crowd who almost let it happen? Sarah reached the checkout counter, her hands still shaking, as she began to unload her cart onto the conveyor belt. The rhythmic beep of the scanner was usually a sound that induced anxiety, a countdown to the moment her funds might run out. But today it sounded like a heartbeat returning to normal. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes who had heard whispers of the commotion, scanned the items with a gentleness that hadn't been there before. She didn't roll her eyes when Sarah double-checked the price of the eggs. She waited patiently, offering a small, sympathetic nod. It was as if the ripple effect of Elias's intervention had traveled faster than Sarah, softening the edges of the usually harsh transaction. Sarah realized that the invisible war she fought daily, the war for dignity while being poor, had been publicly acknowledged, and for once, she wasn't the one losing. Back in the aisle, Elias stood alone again, the crowd having dispersed like mist under the sun, leaving him with the familiar company of inanimate objects. He looked at his hands, the tremors slowly subsiding into a manageable vibration, and felt a strange sensation in his chest, not the usual tightness of panic, but something lighter, expanding. He had stepped out of his designated orbit, broken the rules of his existence to engage with the chaotic variable of human conflict. And the universe hadn't ended. In fact, the universe seemed slightly more ordered because of it. He folded the receipt carefully, creasing the edges with precision until it was a tiny, perfect square, and placed it in his pocket. It wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was evidence that he existed, that he had agency, that his way of seeing the world had value. The manager watched Sarah from the customer service booth, pretending to review paperwork, but actually consumed by a gnawing sense of guilt. He prided himself on running a tight ship, on keeping his store orderly and safe, but he had failed the most basic test of leadership: protecting the vulnerable. He had seen a problem and tried to remove it, mistaking the victim for the disturbance, blinded by his own biases about what a good customer looked like. The image of Elias holding up that receipt, dismantling his authority with simple math, replayed in his mind on a loop. It was a humiliating lesson in humility, a reminder that authority without empathy is just bullying in a tie. He resolved to do better, though he knew the stain of today would linger on his conscience for a long time. Outside the store, the three boys were reviewing their footage, expecting to edit a masterpiece of mockery, but the playback told a different story. On the small screen, they didn't look like cool pranksters. They looked small, petty, and cruel, while the freak they targeted looked strangely heroic. The video captured the silence of the crowd, the fear in the children's eyes, and the unwavering truth in Elias's voice, framing the boys as the villains in their own production. One of them, the quietest of the group, felt a knot of shame tighten in his stomach, a feeling he wasn't used to and didn't know how to process. "Maybe we should delete it," he muttered, a crack appearing in their collective armor of indifference. Sarah paid for her groceries, the total coming to exactly what she had calculated, a small victory that felt monumental today. As she packed her bags, she found an extra chocolate bar in one of them, the same brand her daughter had asked for earlier. She looked up, startled, and saw the woman from the aisle, the one who had given her the tissue, walking away quickly toward the exit. It was a silent gift, an anonymous act of reparation that brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. It wasn't about the chocolate. It was about the message. You are not alone, and you deserve sweetness too. Elias finally moved, resuming his interrupted journey through the store, but his gait was different now, less apologetic, more grounded. He passed a display of sodas that was slightly crooked, and instead of just feeling the itch of annoyance, he reached out and straightened a bottle. He felt a sense of ownership over the space, a subtle shift from being an intruder to being a participant. The shoppers who passed him now didn't stare with open hostility. Some looked away in embarrassment, while others offered tentative nods. He was no longer a ghost haunting the aisles. He was a man who had spoken when everyone else was silent. In the parking lot, Sarah loaded her bags into the trunk of her car, the rusty hinges groaning in protest.
She looked back at the store's automatic doors, half expecting Elias to emerge so she could thank him properly, but he didn't appear. Perhaps it was better this way, she thought. Some angels don't stay for the applause, and some heroes don't wear capes. They wear noise-canceling headphones. She buckled her children into their seats, hugging them a little tighter and a little longer than usual. "Was that man a superhero?" her son asked, his eyes wide with wonder. Sarah smiled, starting the engine. "Yes," she said, "the kind that uses truth as a superpower." The boy who had suggested deleting the video stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over the trash icon. His friends were arguing about captions, trying to spin the narrative, but he couldn't stop hearing Elias's voice. Cruelty is inefficient. The words had burrowed into his brain, a viral idea that was far more powerful than any video they could post. He realized with a sudden sickening clarity that they had been the ones being tested, and they had failed spectacularly. In a moment of rebellion against his own group, he pressed delete, erasing the evidence of their cruelty, but not the memory of it. "It's gone," he said, ignoring their protests, walking away with a strange sense of relief. Inside the store, the atmosphere slowly returned to normal, but the energy was permanently altered. The staff whispered among themselves, retelling the story of the receipt and the rescue, turning Elias into a local legend within minutes. The security guard, usually stoic, found himself helping an elderly lady with her heavy bags, a subconscious attempt to balance his own moral ledger. The incident had acted as a mirror, forcing everyone to confront their own passivity, and in the reflection, Many didn't like what they saw. It was a collective awakening, however brief, sparked by the most unlikely of catalysts. Elias reached the checkout, his own small basket containing only 3 items: a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a notebook. He placed them on the belt with precision, aligning the edges parallel to the metal sides. The cashier smiled at him, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. "Found everything okay today?" she asked, a standard question that felt loaded with new meaning. Elias looked at her, then at the receipt printer, then back at her. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "Found everything needed." He wasn't talking about the groceries. As Sarah drove home, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road, but her internal world felt brighter than it had in months. She touched her purse where her wallet lay, thinking of the crumpled bills and the struggle that awaited her tomorrow. But the fear was less paralyzing. She had been reminded that humanity still existed in the cracks of a broken system, that help could come from the most unexpected places. She wasn't just a statistic or a stereotype. She was a person worthy of defense. And she knew, with a certainty that warmed her chest, that she would never be a bystander again if she saw someone else in trouble. The store manager sat in his office, reviewing the security footage of the incident, watching the scene play out in grainy black and white. He saw himself arrive, saw his aggressive stance, saw his bias in action, and he felt a wave of shame wash over him. Then he saw Elias step in, a lone figure of resistance against a tide of bullying, and he paused the video. He zoomed in on Elias's face, pixelated but resolute, and realized he was looking at the bravest person in his store. He closed his eyes, making a silent vow to change his training protocols, to teach his staff, and himself, to look closer before judging. Elias walked home, the rhythm of his footsteps matching the beat of a song only he could hear. The world was still loud, still chaotic, still overwhelming, but he felt a new strength in his core. He had calculated the cost of kindness and found it affordable. He had solved a social equation that baffled everyone else. He wasn't cured of his autism, nor did he want to be. He was simply Elias, and today, Elias was enough. He touched the receipt in his pocket one last time, a souvenir from the day he decided to be visible. The question of who was truly tested lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Was it the mother, pushed to the brink of despair? Was it the autistic man, forced out of his comfort zone? Or was it the silent majority, the people who stood by and watched, waiting for permission to be good? Perhaps the test is never really over. Perhaps it resets every time we step out of our doors, every time we see injustice and have to decide whether to look away or to speak up. And in the end, maybe redemption isn't a grand gesture, but a crumpled receipt and a voice saying, "This is wrong." Elias sat at his small kitchen table, the silence of his apartment a welcome balm after the sensory storm of the supermarket. He placed the receipt in the center of the table, smoothing it out one last time, treating it with the reverence of a historical document. Beside it, he opened his new notebook, the pages crisp and white, waiting for data. He picked up a pen and wrote the date at the top, his handwriting precise and angular. Underneath, he didn't write a shopping list or a schedule. He wrote a single sentence. Variable, courage. Outcome, positive. It was a scientific log of an emotional event, his way of integrating the day's anomaly into his understanding of the world. He realized that courage wasn't a feeling. He had felt only terror, but an action, a calculation where the cost of doing nothing was higher than the cost of intervening. Sarah tucked her children into bed, their small bodies finally relaxed after the day's tension. Her son looked up at her, sleepy but serious. "Why were those boys mean?" he asked, the eternal question of innocence confronting cruelty. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, searching for an answer that was honest, but not crushing. "Some people are in pain," she said softly, "and they don't know what to do with it, so they throw it at others." It was a generous explanation, perhaps more than they deserved. but she refused to let their ugliness plant seeds of hate in her son's heart. She kissed his forehead, whispering, "But remember the man who helped. Remember the helpers." She wanted that to be the lesson, not the cruelty of the few, but the unexpected kindness of the one. In a different part of town, the boy who had deleted the video sat in his room staring at his reflection in the dark screen of his phone. The group chat was blowing up with angry messages from his friends, demanding to know why he had killed the content. He didn't reply. He felt a strange disconnection from them, as if he were looking at strangers he had known for years. The thrill of the prank, the rush of the likes, it all felt hollow and sickening now. He remembered Elias's eyes, devoid of malice but full of intensity, and the weight of his own actions pressed down on him. He realized he had been a bully, a word he used for other people, never himself. It was a painful awakening, the cracking of a shell he hadn't known he was wearing. The manager of the store couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, the image of Sarah's tear-streaked face haunting his thoughts. He got up and paced his living room, pouring himself a glass of water he didn't drink. He thought about his own mother, who had raised him alone, struggling with bills just like Sarah. How had he forgotten? How had he let the uniform and the badge erase his own history? He realized that in his quest for order, he had sacrificed humanity, becoming a cog in a machine that ground people down instead of lifting them up. He resolved that tomorrow things would change. He would implement new training, yes, but more importantly, he would start looking people in the eye again. Sarah sat on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the moon rise over the quiet neighborhood. She felt a shift deep inside her, a hardening of her resolve that wasn't bitter but strong. For years she had walked with her head down, apologizing for her existence, hoping not to be noticed. Today she had been noticed in the worst way, and she had survived. More than that, she had been defended. The shame that usually clung to her like a second skin was gone, washed away by the truth Elias had spoken. She realized that poverty was a circumstance, not a character flaw, and she would no longer carry it as a secret sin. She was a good mother, a survivor, and she had allies in this world, even if they were strangers. Elias finished his entry in the notebook and closed it, the sound a satisfying thud in the quiet room. He walked to the window and looked out at the streetlights, seeing patterns in the way the light fell on the pavement. Usually the world outside felt like a chaotic, hostile place, a puzzle he couldn't solve. But tonight the patterns seemed a little clearer. He understood now that he had a role to play, a specific function in the social equation. He wasn't just an observer. He was a variable that could change the outcome. The thought was terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating. He had power. The power of truth. The power of disrupting the inefficient flow of cruelty. The next morning, the store felt different. The employees moved with a lighter step, the tension of the previous day replaced by a sense of shared purpose. The cashier who had smiled at Elias told the story to the morning shift, and it spread like wildfire, transforming into a local parable. Customers who hadn't even been there heard about it and looked around with softer eyes, perhaps hoping to spot the hero, or simply influenced by the lingering energy of goodwill. The store was no longer just a place of commerce. It had become a place of community, however temporary. It showed how a single act of moral clarity can sanitize a toxic environment, leaving it cleaner than bleach ever could. Sarah walked into her job at the diner, tying her apron with a new firmness. When a rude customer snapped his fingers at her for coffee, she didn't flinch or apologize profusely as she usually would. She walked over, looked him in the eye, and said calmly, "I'll be with you in a moment, sir." The customer, surprised by her composed dignity, sat back and waited. It was a small victory, a ripple from the supermarket reaching the diner. She was claiming her space, demanding the respect she now knew she deserved. Elias's voice was in her head. Cruelty is inefficient. She wouldn't let anyone be inefficient with her time or her spirit anymore. Elias walked his usual route to the library, his headphones on, but the music was turned down slightly. He was testing the waters, allowing a little more of the world to filter in. He passed a group of teenagers and felt the old spike of fear, but he didn't cross the street. He kept walking, his receipt talisman in his pocket, reminding himself that he had faced worse and won. He noticed one of the teens look at him, but instead of mocking, the boy just nodded. It was a nothing moment, a non-event, but for Elias it was a confirmation. The monster of public judgment had lost its teeth. The boy who deleted the video finally texted back to the group chat. "I'm out," he wrote. 2 words that severed his ties to a toxic friendship and set him on a lonely, but honest path. He knew he would lose his social standing, maybe even become a target himself, but he didn't care. He had seen what kind of men they were becoming, and he wanted no part of it. He felt lighter, as if he had dropped a heavy backpack he hadn't realized he was carrying. He walked to school alone, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like himself. Weeks later, Sarah returned to the supermarket. She hesitated at the doors, a phantom memory of fear gripping her, but she pushed through. She walked the same aisles, past the same spot where she had been surrounded. It was just a floor now, just tiles and shelves. She saw Elias in the produce section, inspecting apples with intense concentration. She didn't interrupt him. She knew better now. She simply walked past and whispered, "Thank you," to the air, knowing he would hear it. He didn't look up, but she saw his shoulders relax, a silent acknowledgement received. They were orbiters in the same galaxy, forever connected by gravity. The story of the receipt hero never made the news, never went viral on TikTok, and never got a hashtag. It remained a local legend, a quiet truth shared over coffee and whispered in checkout lines, and maybe that was better. Viral fame fades in a day, but a local legend changes the culture of a place. The supermarket became known as the friendly store, not because of corporate policy, but because the people there had learned a lesson about humanity. They looked out for each other now, a legacy of the day the math man stood up to the bullies. One day, Elias found a small envelope in his mailbox. Inside was no note, just a drawing. It was a stick figure of a man with headphones, wearing a cape, holding a long piece of paper like a sword. Underneath, in childish scrawl, it said, "The Truth Man." Elias stared at it for a long time, a rare smile touching his lips. He pinned it to his refrigerator right next to his schedule. It was illogical, scientifically inaccurate, and utterly perfect. It was data that proved he was loved. And so, life continued, as it always does. The sun rose, the bills came, the world turned. But for a few people, the axis had shifted slightly. Sarah walked taller. The manager led with heart. The boy chose kindness. And Elias kept rocking, kept counting, kept existing. But he knew now that his existence wasn't an error. It was a necessary variable in the equation of being human. And sometimes, when the world got too loud and cruel, he would touch his pocket and remember, outcome, positive. Sometimes the true test isn't about who is being put to the test, but about who chooses to be human when no one is obligated to be. The world is full of cameras, but what we really need are witnesses who don't just watch, but who truly see.
If you have ever felt the weight of judgment from people who don't know your story, or if you understand the loneliness of fighting daily battles that go unseen, please hit the like button and subscribe to help us strengthen this community of empathy. Stories like Sarah and Elias's remind us that true strength isn't found in shouting, but in reaching out a hand. So tell me in the comments below, have you ever had the courage to stand up for someone in public? Or have you ever been saved by a stranger when you needed it most?